So I'm really big into traveling, and over the last few years, I've been to a lot of national parks, mostly in the United States and Canada. And there's one very disconcerting trend that I've noticed over the last few years in the national parks, which I suppose could be extended to the tourism industry as a whole, but mostly in the national parks and state and provincial parks, which is contempt for the visitor. There is a growing movement of people among the national park staff, primarily on an administrative level, but also among much of the general public, particularly those on the political left, who feel increasingly that the idea of national parks was a mistake. Ironically, national parks are called America's best idea, but they're increasingly being seen as a bad idea by liberals and leftists. Now, why is that? Well, it's because they feel that national parks shouldn't be for the masses, for the filthy, unwashed masses. They feel that these spaces should be preserved only for a select few. That more than anything else, they belong to the animals and maybe to the Native Americans, but they don't belong to the average person. They sure as hell don't belong to tourists from other countries. And really, the only people who they feel belong there are Native Americans, park staff, maybe locals who live immediately adjacent to the park, and I guess obviously the elites, because the elites always manage to get around every rule. Now, how is this trend manifesting itself? Well, an increasing number of national parks have these reservation systems where you have to reserve a ticket online in advance of when you go, and there's only a certain amount of tickets issued. These tickets are often issued weeks or months in advance of the day that you plan on going, and very often you have to reserve them within maybe 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, or else they completely sell out. It can vary a lot from park to park and based on what day you're reserving it for. With some, you might be able to get away with reserving it a few hours after the ticket entry window opens online. With others, you'll be lucky if you get a ticket if you take as long as 2 minutes after the window opens. So it can really vary from park to park, but I'd say on average, they often fill up maybe 15 to 20 minutes after the online window opens. And the thing about this is obviously, it's a process that favors certain people over others. In particular, it favors people who have flexibility in their work lives, because it's like to be able to log on to a computer at a specific place and time requires a certain amount of flexibility in your work life. And it also favors people who have enough money to frankly buy a shit ton of tickets and then only use them for certain days. Because if you're not sure exactly when you want to go, then you basically have to do that. And that is what a lot of people do, because I've heard that something like 25% of all these tickets end up being no-shows, people who don't show up at all. Now, when I do this, I usually have the decency to at least cancel the tickets in advance if I'm not using them on a particular date. And if I do that, often somebody else will grab them up at the last minute. So that's at least a courtesy, a nice thing to do in that situation, but a lot of people don't even do that. So all in all, these reservation systems have made it a complete pain in the ass to get to any national park that has them. If you're not gonna, it makes it a pain in the ass to do it in a way that's even the slightest bit spontaneous. There has to be so much pre-planning, and I basically have to rely on the graciousness of my employer. Luckily, I'm not in a job that's particularly inflexible in that regard, but a lot of people are. So by and by, it is a system that makes it a pain in the ass to go to national parks in the first place. But that's not all of it. In addition to these reservation systems, there's an absolute refusal to build park infrastructure to accommodate higher numbers of tourists. Now, as somebody who's railed quite a bit against car culture, I can understand why they don't want to expand parking lots, for instance, but it raises the question, why can't they expand mass transit within the parks? There are some parks that have a bus shuttle system. Why not expand those systems, have more buses, bring shuttle bus systems into parks that don't already have them, like increase the number of buses, increase the number of locations within the parks that the buses go to. There's all kinds of things they can do without making the parks even more car dependent or adding more parking. And I mean, in some cases, adding more parking may not be that much of a problem if the parking lot is really small to begin with. But in other cases, the shuttle bus option would also be something they could do. Another option would be to only have a reservation system for the most crowded parts of the park, because in many cases it's only a specific part of the park that gets overcrowded, but yet the reservation systems apply to the entire park as a whole, including regions of the park that, if anything, are undercrowded. So that's another issue. Another issue with this is that it goes along with the much bigger problem of overpopulation, because I think we're seeing this as a consequence of it. On a world scale, there's simply more people, not to mention more people in the United States and Canada, thanks to mass immigration. And I think it speaks to the bigger picture of this idea that, like, there's going to be more people in the world, but the average person is going to have a lower quality of life, or at least the average person in Western countries is going to have a lower quality of life. So it's basically like, I forget which one is R and which one is K, but it's the rabbit type selection. It's the selection where there's going to be just more people, and each average person is going to have a lower quality of life compared to beforehand. And I think this is part of it. This idea that, like, oh, you're not entitled to see these national parks even though your tax dollars pay for them. You're not entitled to go to these places because fuck you. Because we're going to live in a world with 10 billion people for some fucking reason, or 12 billion or some ridiculous shit like that. And each person is going to live like a serf. That's basically the vision that the elites have for the future, and frankly, it sucks. And it speaks to the question, like, why do we need all this immigration? Why do we need a growth-based economy? Why can't we seek other methods of running our economy without relying on constant population growth? Because frankly, this is one of the consequences of that growth, like this idea that we have to implement all these severe restrictions at national parks because there's too many people in them. And I don't blame people for wanting to go to the parks. And that's another aspect of this contempt, because I see this a lot among liberals, this contempt not only for people going to these parks, but for people to even want to go to these parks. It's like, how dare you feel entitled to go to these places? How dare you even want to go to these places? You need to accept your lot in life, you fucking serf, you piece of shit. Eat the bugs and hook yourself up to VR. You know, oh, you want to travel? Hook yourself up to some shitty fucking VR travel, some experience that doesn't even feel authentic and that won't be good for exercise or fresh air and won't give you any sense of personal fulfillment, but at best may alleviate your boredom for a few hours. You know, it'll be no different from watching some shitty TV show. Like, that's basically what they want you to do. And contrary to what people say, I don't think they envision the average person to live in a pod, because frankly, that's the only thing I think the average person won't give up. They won't give up their suburbs and they won't give up their SUVs. But I am growing increasingly convinced that travel is something that the average person is willing to give up without a fight, or without much of a fight. And that's why you see, for instance, at the airports in Canada, we're having these horrible delays, and the press is telling people, well, you're entitled if you complain about these delays. And that's basically what they're telling you. They're telling you, let them eat bugs. You fucking serf. Eat shit and love it. You will hook yourself up to your fucking VR tourism and you will love it. You will be in your fucking digital fucking matrix tourism and you will love it, you know? Oh, why go to the national park? You know, you can just hike in the fake mountains in the Matrix where the Merovingian's chateau is. Although, actually, I'm not going to lie, that would be pretty cool to go to the Merovingian's chateau. But again, I would rather go to a place like that in real life rather than hooked up to a computer simulation. So yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know. This whole thing speaks to just how dystopian our society is becoming. And if you don't believe me, like, there's been a lot of, like, I remember there was recently flooding in Yellowstone National Park. And there are all these comments. It was like, I think it was like a Washington Post article, and all the comments were people saying, good, I hope the park remains closed to tourists forever. Fuck you for wanting to have this experience. You know, maybe not every experience should be witnessed by humans. And when they say that, what they mean is maybe not every experience should be witnessed by you, the average middle class human. Bill Gates still gets to have these experiences, but you don't, you fucking piece of shit. Accept your lot in life, conform and comply, and fucking eat shit. Eat fucking shit and love it, you piece of shit serf. And this is something that, to some extent, it transcends ideology, because I see some people on the right saying similar things, but it does seem to go along with like people who want this whole change in society that's been happening over the last few years. People who support this idea of incremental lower standards of living. And to me, I do understand that on some ways we do need to, be less wasteful when it comes to resources. But I disagree with the idea that like something like going to national parks can't be more compatible with a sustainable future. I think it can be in the ways I outlined, having it more reliant on mass transit rather than cars, for instance, even though I don't think it can be 100% reliant on mass transit, because some of the more isolated locations in parks, I think, are never going to be viable for mass transit. But that's okay, because those aren't the areas where overcrowding is the problem to begin with. So, I mean, I do think there's ways to make national parks more sustainable in an environmental sense, but I don't think it's really about sustainability to these people. I think it's about the fact that, frankly, they just kind of want to see the average person suffer, and they're not willing to even look at solutions where we can have a good quality of life for the average person while still being environmentally sustainable. They don't want to look for these solutions because, frankly, these people are just misanthropes who want to see the average person suffer. And they want to see, like, they're okay with the fact that the elite are the only people who would have these experiences in this dystopian future that they envision, because they're fine with that, because they hate the average person. They want the average person to suffer. And that's basically their ideology. Now, me personally, I do think the average person is too wasteful in some ways, but I think there's ways to solve that without condemning everyone to having a shitty quality of life. Like, again, like mass transit, like better trains, like making things more dependent on mass transit rather than cars, I think is a great solution to a more sustainable future. Designing neighborhoods that are less sprawled. No, it does not mean everybody has to live in a fucking pod. It just means designing neighborhoods that are more viable for walking and transit rather than driving everywhere. And again, people say like, well, public transit is unsafe. It's like, yes, but that's because the way public transit is currently set up is that the most of the people who use it are poor people from the poorer demographics of society, who obviously are the demographics that have a higher crime rate. But if mass transit was more like in Europe, where it's something that the average person uses, then it would be less inherently shady, because it wouldn't just be full of like essentially the lower classes. And I've seen that personally. There are some places where public transit, even in North America, is designed better and works better, and where it's not just the lower classes who are on it. And frankly, like, there could be, to some extent, even things like, different class cars. You could pay more maybe to be in like a first class subway car, first class train car, whatever, for people who really don't want to rub shoulders with like riffraff. I don't know. I mean, there's all kinds of solutions we could look at for these various issues. But the fact is, my broader picture here is that I think a lot of these people who favor all these restrictions in national parks and everywhere else, this, I don't even want to say the term because I don't want to get this video flagged. This, good reboot, the good reboot of society. So this whole idea that has come about in the last few years of the good reboot, it's like, yeah, I do think this isn't just a conspiracy theory. I think there is, to some extent, a real agenda to implement the good reboot. Um, for the people who thought that the Star Wars sequel trilogy was a good reboot, now we have the real good reboot for all of you. So yeah, I mean, I don't. I think that this is about fundamentally rubbing the average person's face in shit. That's what this whole attitude is about at national parks and elsewhere. And frankly, yeah, I think that is what's going on here. And as a final note on the subject, this idea that national parks are just for animals, it's like, I'm sorry, that's not what they were founded as. They were founded as a place for humans and animals to enjoy. And frankly, I think that people will appreciate national parks more and will be more willing to support them if they have a stake in it, if they're actually allowed to visit these places themselves rather than just see pictures of them on TV or on the internet. And I think it gives people an added reason to support them. And also, frankly, like these places that are overcrowded in the national parks, they're often overcrowded for a reason because they're the most beautiful places. And frankly, like a bear does not appreciate the symmetry of Lake Louise or the patterns of the mountains at Moraine Lake or Moline Lake in the same way that a human does. The bear might see the lake as a source of water, as a source of sustenance, but the bear does not appreciate beauty in the same way humans do. And I'm sorry, it's just true for animals in general. They might be cute and cuddly, but they don't appreciate the beauty of the Grand Canyon or of Lake Louise in the same way a human does. And I'm sorry if it offends certain people, like environmentalists, conservationists, to hear that, but it's just true. Okay, there is an element of human experience involved in these national parks, of appreciating whether you believe it's designed by God or designed coincidentally by nature, appreciating the beauty of these places in the same way that people appreciate the beauty of man-made wonders in places like Venice or Paris. And I'm sorry to say that, like, yeah, a fucking moose doesn't see Lake Louise any differently than like any plain old lake that's nothing particularly spectacular about it. They see at the end of the day, it's just a fucking lake to them. And it takes a human brain to comprehend the idea of beauty. Animals don't appreciate beauty in the same way humans do. And that's why, for instance, a place like Lake Louise could be seen as, on some level, a place for humans, whereas backwoods areas of the parks that don't have any particular specific natural beauty in the same way somewhere like Lake Louise does are more places for animals. And again, that might upset some people to hear that, might offend them to hear that, but it's the fucking truth. So anyway, that's all I have to say on that subject for now.